This is the last in the Christian tradition course series of lectures. I have looked at the patristic tradition, the vision of the early church from the 2nd to the 7th centuries. I've touched down on the Reformation and how in many ways the 16th century in the West at least birthed the modern liberal world as we know it, and without realizing it, there were these unintended consequences that as the Reformation became secularized, particularly its principles, it brings us into the modern liberal world in which choice, liberty, individuality, conscience, and many of these other premises or prejudices of liberalism have come to dominate, and we, in one sense, still live in the Protestant world, just a secularized version of it. The content has changed, but the principles remain the same. I also lingered longer on Erasmus and Luther for the simple reason that in many ways they take the West, they take Christianity in very different directions. Erasmus, the irenical thinker who understood mystery and ambiguity when it came to history, when it came to the Bible, when it came to politics. He understood the layered nature of interpretation. Luther, on the other hand, and those who follow the Lutheran tradition, whether Reformed, Anabaptist, Mennonite, and then, of course, the increasing fragmentation of Protestantism, draw much, much more from a tradition of certainty, one-dimensional read of the Bible, usually to some degree of the Christian tradition itself. And then as a result of that, they tend to differ on whose read is the best, and hence Protestant fragmentation. So what we're going to do then, so Erasmus and Luther in that sense are crossroads thinkers, not only within Christianity, but within Western civilization itself. They're two very different epistemologies, and the consequences of those, one leads to a greater sense of working towards unity, recognizing there are differences. The other is much more committed to certainty, and those who differ with a certain view of certainty, they fragment into, in this case, into Christianity, into different denominations, Lutheran, Reformed, Anabaptist, Baptist, and as you move through history, inevitably, a Pentecostal, E-Free, Alliance. We can go on, Nazarene, you can go on and on with the varied denominations that emerge, each thinking that their interpretation of their experience of the Spirit, of the Bible, of the Christian tradition is the right one. And you just secularize that, and then we're just into the big discussions these days about whose version of identity should be honored, or what position is right, is wrong, and each arguing that pluralism is the way to go because there is no right or wrong. Or the other perspective, of course, is the secularized Lutheranism, in which these are the issues a person has to line up with on the left or the right if they're going to be true to the ideology that they're committed to. Now, I want to end with this particular lecture looking at the Christian tradition as it's engaging the modern world. Obviously, 500 years can only be traversed in a rather hasty way, but I want to touch on some of the main themes. So it'll be more like a helicopter going over a series of mountain ranges and ridges and summits, and I'll just point out some of them in this particular flight over the historic mountain terrain. So of the three major forms of Christianity that emerged in the 16th century, obviously two were very much alert and alive, and I will come to them. But the first, which is the largest form of Christianity today, is the Roman Catholic tradition. Now, in the 16th century, what happened in the clash between Roman Catholicism and the very confessional traditions in the 16th century is each of these confessional or Protestant confessional traditions took the position they understood what the authentic form of Christianity was, and they articulated that in their confessions. So you have the Lutheran confessions, you have various Reformed traditions, you have the Schleitheim confession of the Anabaptist Mennonite. And each of these groups fragmented. Now, what happened in the Roman Catholic tradition, as they watched these various forms of Protestantism clearly defining what each group thought was authentic Christianity, the Roman Catholic tradition did much the same thing. So out of this comes the Treaty of Trent in the 16th century. Interestingly enough, as Erasmus lived in this middle way, a bridge builder between, in his time, Luther and the Roman Catholic tradition. And many conservative Roman Catholics thought Erasmus was too fond of Luther and backing him too much. They became very suspicious of Erasmus himself. So with the Treaty of Trent in the 16th century, they formed their own, as it were, confessional tradition in which they defined what authentic Roman Catholic thinking was. And Erasmus himself, and of course an index came out of that that articulated who are the writers, the thinkers one should be suspicious of, not read heretics or heterodox. And that index listed many of the writers of the time that, as it were, the Roman Catholic Sanhedrin saw as problematic and did not embody authentic Roman Catholic Christianity. Erasmus himself was put on that index. The Treaty of Trent, is very important within the Roman Catholic tradition for almost pretty well the 16th century up to Vatican II in the 1960s. That way of thinking defines substantive elements of Roman Catholic thought in terms of there's no salvation outside the church. They are the church. The modern world they were entering was highly problematic. First of all, Protestantism was the major enemy that threatened authentic Roman Catholic thought. And then with the coming to be of the Enlightenment tradition, evolution, Roman Catholic tradition pulled back from that. How can you square evolution with authentic Roman Catholic theology? Higher, lower criticism of texts. Surely the texts are not something that one engages in higher, lower criticism. The truth of other religions. What do we do with that? The Roman Catholic Church is the answer, and others are not quite of the same caliber, worth, or significance. Politics, the Roman Catholic Church tended to lean to the right. And of course, what reinforced this right of center suspicion of modernity was the French Revolution of 1789, in which with the coming to be of a certain type of liberalism within the revolution, it was the Catholic Church that was marginalized. Catholic priests were killed, parishioners were killed, people fled. And so this reinforced the dangers of the modern world for many, many Catholics and the aggressive nature of a certain type of liberalism that would even reject religion. So not only were Catholics concerned with some of the ideas of the modern world, but they watched it being folded into a political agenda in which secularism itself was going to banish the sacred. And of course, as Catholics, they thought that was about them. And so by the time you get to the French Revolution, you get the sacred, i.e. the Roman Catholic tradition itself is the problem. So secularism becomes the reigning ideology. So what you get is this circling of the wagons in the Roman Catholic tradition, and the sense that you can't trust the modern world, both at an intellectual level, at a political level, at a scientific level, at a textual level, at an interfaith level. And so there's this closing the windows on the world and entrenching themselves and seeing themselves as the bastion of genuine Christianity against a world which is out to undermine, destroy the foundations, root, branch, and fruit. And so from really Trent up to Vatican II, there was a form of Catholicism that really very much turned in on itself as defending the true faith. By the 20th century, there were a variety of Roman Catholic thinkers, Chenu, Dillebach, Maritain. There's many others who were arguing that this reactionary stance was not even good Catholic thinking in terms of catecholis according to the whole. And so the form of Roman Catholicism that emerged between the 16th century and Vatican II of the early 19th centuries, there were two tendencies within the Roman Catholic Church which were calling into question the Tridentine position. One went back to the fathers of the Church of the East and West, arguing their vision of Christianity could never be reduced to the shrinking world of the Tridentine position. There were the other that argued that there is a form of good liberalism, in fact, that opens people up to insights that when one shuts down on it, even the good that comes out of liberalism is ignored. And so there was a form of thinkers, which was embodied in some way, Pope John XXIII, who was the Pope of Vatican II, who tried to see that there were the two wings that opposed Tridentine Catholicism. One that argued that, in fact, liberalism did bring some good, much good, in terms of working class people, in terms of women, in terms of what science was going, philosophy was going. And so, what could the Roman Catholic Church learn from the best of liberalism? Not just demonizing liberalism as the problem, Trent versus liberalism. Then there were others who said, if you get back to the classical phase of Christianity, it was a much more dynamic project in understanding theology, philosophy, politics, literature, culture, liturgy, sacraments, all of these issues. And so with Vatican II, you get two movements in the Roman Catholic Church, one increasingly moving in the direction of liberalism, which eventually plays itself into progressive Catholicism today, or a form of liberal Catholicism, which is, and this would have been the fear of some of the Tridentine Catholics, that assimilates essentially into the Catholic world, almost drawing from Hegelian synthesis. So we're moving ever forward. So on that sort of, in a contemporary sense, the progressive wing, we can see some of the Catholics who very much come out of that are attempting to synthesize science and religion in the forward march in history. So thinkers like Teilhard de Chardin, in terms of bringing together theology, science, evolution. Thomas Berry, very important in all of this, and Berry draws from Teilhard de Chardin. Richard Rohr is probably the most popular and trendy Roman Catholic, a Franciscan at the present time. He runs the Center of Action Contemplation in New Mexico, and many come to that center in terms of his thinking, what he's articulating. And so within this form of progressive Catholicism at the present time, Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, Richard Rohr, back of him would be Matthew Fox, for example, who is he still is not as active as he once was, but again, his digging into the tradition, his interpretation of Aquinas and Meister Eckhart. He's a far more sophisticated thinker. He's a Dominican, not a Franciscan, far more sophisticated than Richard Rohr, but his center in California at one time was once the hub in many ways of progressive Catholicism. He clashed eventually with the Pope, and he was told he could no more teach as a Roman Catholic. He finally left the Roman Catholic Church and became an Episcopal priest, but he's still very active. So people like Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, Richard Rohr, Matthew Fox, Brian Swim. There's many others who are seen as on the cutting edge of a progressive Catholicism, and you'll get many what's sometimes called cafeteria Catholics are very, very much follow them. There's also been the reaction the other way, which of course does not want to buy into the Tridentine position of getting back to the mothers and fathers of the church. And so this is quite a movement as well. You find this in the Anglican tradition, you find it in the Roman Catholic tradition, in Anglicanism, the radical Orthodox ethos that John Milbank, Simon Oliver, and many others hold to. Also in Anglicans, say Hans Boersma's work, getting back to the sacramental tradition of the patristic heritage. This whole way of thinking was, as I mentioned earlier, sort of augured by people like Dillebach, Chenu, Maritain, and there's many others. So it was back to the sources, ad fontes, as it were. So it's called the Renovare tradition, a ressourcement tradition. And so there's three wings in the Roman Catholic heritage very, very much at work right now. There's those which continually are surfing the wave of the late modern, postmodern, seeing in a Hegelian-like way that evolution is moving the church and history and people forward into an ever, what Teilhard would call the omega point in history. And to the degree one understands where the spirit is in that process, they're on the cusp of history, similar to Joachim of Fiore earlier, who thought he was the one who understood the spirit, and those who didn't agree with him didn't understand the spirit. So you get this progressive wing of the Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, Richard Rohr, Matthew Fox, Brian Swim. There's many, many others who are part of that. You get the others that are going back to the mothers and fathers of the church, and then you have within the Roman Catholic Church the attempt to reinstate Trent, Tridentine perspective, because they feel with the progressives, foundations are falling apart. There is no center anymore, and people are just making up Catholicism as they wish at any given point on the journey. So there's a whole movement to get back of Vatican II to Tridentine Catholicism, to do the Mass in Latin. When the Pope speaks, that's the vicar on earth speaking. A strong authoritarian tradition in which top down you just obey, you do what you're told, there's no questions asked. And so the movement to Tridentine Catholicism is also very, very pronounced. You can see this played out very clearly between the recent popes in the Roman Catholic Church. The present one comes from Latin America. Pope Francis, obviously his name is taken from Francis of Assisi. Very concerned with peace and justice issues, structural injustice. Situation in Latin America could not be more clear and obvious in terms of power and powerlessness. Some see him as really just an agent of liberation theology, which previous popes have again and again tried to marginalize, silence. So Francis represents that, what seems to be an openness to engaging the church on meaningful political, social, economic issues, whether it's issues of women, whether it's issues of priests being married. There's a whole range of issues that have come up here, which of course threatens the Tridentine Catholics. The previous Pope Benedict, within the Tridentine perspective, they see him as standing for authentic and genuine Christianity, of which Pope Francis in many ways is seen as undermining. So Roman Catholicism then is torn between three traditions. Now, within that, there is not schism per se, and yet there is informal schism, formal unity, informal fragmentation. And so Roman Catholicism is the largest form of Christianity today. It embodies immense internal conflicts and divisions between a patristic understanding of faith and its relevance for today, Tridentine Catholicism, and then progressive Catholicism in regards to gender issues, in regards to feminism, in regards to ecological issues, in regards to justice, war and peace issues, how you interpret the past. As I mentioned, Matthew Fox has done a lot of work on interpreting elements of the Roman Catholic Church. It was Augustine Aquinas. He does his own read of Aquinas, but his real, as a Dominican, who he draws from even more than Aquinas, is Meister Eckhart. And so you get Fox doing these very creative reads of the past. In a way, Richard Rohr just doesn't have those abilities. There's often been historically a clash within the Roman Catholic Church between Dominicans and Franciscans, one anticipating the Jesuits in terms of a very rigorous learning and thinking, the other much more of the heart, even though obviously within the Franciscans you have Bonaventura as well, very sophisticated thinker, Mind's Road to God and things like this. So Roman Catholicism, when we look at the largest form of Christianity, this obviously is a divided community, and Pope Francis is grappling with how he makes sense of that, given all the hot button issues in the culture wars. The second form of Christianity, which emerged in the 16th century, was Protestantism. The Protestant tradition has tended to go in a variety of different directions, but two of the more prominent of those directions have been, one has been, okay, we are moving into the modern world. Liberalism is the defining feature of modernity, and so the church must accommodate liberal modernity if it's going to be relevant. And what are some of these relevant issues? Well, it can be anything from what's the relationship of religion and science and evolution and biology, or religion and philosophy, or religion and politics, religion and gender, religion and identity. And so the liberal wing of Protestantism that you will find in Lutheranism, you'll find it in the Reformed tradition, you'll find elements of it in the Mennonite, you find it in Presbyterianism, has tended to go in the direction of assimilation largely. So there's this veneer of Christianity. The storefront is Christianity, but when you actually get in, for most of the hot button issues in the culture wars, these various forms of liberal Protestantism have virtually assimilated into the modern culture. You find the same thing at the how higher and lower criticism is done. What texts of the Bible can you believe? What are just superimposed and really not there in the first century, but mere the product of a power elite emerging in the church, which decided what books, what interpretation should be run, who was marginalized, the Gnostics and many others. So there's this whole tradition of biblical criticism, reinterpreting the first, second, third centuries. Lane Pagels is very important in all of that. The Nag Hammadi text I studied with some of in my undergraduate, some of the leading Gnostic scholars in the world. And so this wing, this liberal wing of Christianity, then has moved in the direction of essentially assimilating into the expectations of liberal modernity. The reaction to that then has been conservative Protestantism, and you find that in various evangelical churches. And their position largely is when liberal Protestantism moves in one direction, the numbers drop, the church in the seeking to be relevant becomes irrelevant in many ways, and the greatest numbers in churches today come from conservative Protestant traditions. And so within Protestantism, whether it's reactionary, Missouri Synod Lutherans, or you get charismatic movements, Pentecostal traditions in that sense, many Mennonite congregations, particularly the megachurch congregations, are turning to neo-Calvinism. So Calvin has become, there's been quite a resurrection of Calvin's thinking through thinkers like Piper and Keller and MacArthur. Jim Packer would be back of all of that, is probably one of the living Puritans of today. And so this tension that's going on in Protestantism today between the renewal of Calvinism, a certain interpretation of Calvin, I might add, that it can always be questioned whether this is genuine Calvin or Calvinism, but it's definitely set at odds with liberal Protestantism. So there's this tension going on between, and a lot of seminaries now are leaning in this neo-Calvinist direction, and the churches, which are some of the biggest, in fact, right now in the Gospel Coalition and movements like this, are very, very much informed by a neo-Calvinist agenda, seeing liberal Protestantism as the problem. And so Protestantism, and then out of this comes the emergent church traditions, the emerging church traditions, in which, in that sense, just as in the 16th century you had ecclesial fragmentation, now in late modern or postmodern thought, some of these evangelical congregations who see themselves on the cutting edge of renewal, all they are doing is perpetuating further fragmentation as they start their own little denominations or congregations. And so in that sense, even though they're critiquing liberalism, the very creation of new denominations and fragmenting and breaking away, that's very much rooted in choice, liberty, just as in the 16th century, what Luther, Calvin, and Anabaptists were doing. So they're deeply liberal themselves in a different way. They're liberal when it comes to using their choice to invent forms of Christianity that didn't exist before. And so many people think, if you ask them, if they claim to be Christian, the next question, well, what form of Christianity are you exactly talking about? And the more thoughtful will begin to articulate theologically, ecclesially, what this is all about. The less articulate and thoughtful just say, I go to this church and that's Christian. We'd say, well, no, what type of Christian? There's no such thing as just mere Christian. There is always interpretations going on, and usually postmodern denominations reflect that. So the whole movement that's breaking away from even historic Protestant churches, whether it's Reformed, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Mennonite, into fragmentary denominations and congregations, is very much a part of the postmodern or late modern mood. I make it up, I choose, I invent. That's just 16th century thinking now applied in postmodern fragmentation. The other turn of the Christian tradition, which we're seeing amongst many who grew up in conservative evangelical backgrounds, fundamentalist backgrounds, and they grew disenchanted with it. They felt that it lacked depth. And many of them had gone through their own journey of exploring, usually rejecting that particular tradition. It was too narrow. They felt their head was in a bag. They were suffocating in a Progrestian bed, and they thought their faith was much bigger and deeper. And so, after a few years of experimenting with some of these fragmentary denominations, the longing is for depth, for history. And they recognized with their Protestant upbringing, and if it was evangelical, it was probably even less historical, totally steeped in memoricide or no memory whatsoever, that the hunger is for something solid, deeper, historical. So there has been, in the last 30, 40 years, and even in an accelerated way, a turn to orthodoxy. The Orthodox tradition, whether of the Russian Orthodox tradition, the Greek Orthodox, the Antiochian Orthodox, because there is a sense this is a 2,000-year-old tradition grounded in the mothers and fathers of the patristic era, the 2nd to the 7th century. And so there is ethnic orthodoxy, which many of the recent converts or Caucasian converts to Orthodox don't belong to these ethnic Orthodox parishes. But there is a growth of new converts to Orthodoxy from people who've come from various forms of conservative evangelical traditions. Now, there's a history, of course, since the Russian Revolution of 1917, where many of the Russian Orthodox had to flee, many of them to Paris, a group of them to England. Out of that came the Society of St. Alban and St. Sergius, which was a bringing together of Anglican and Orthodox working together to protect the Orthodox people against what was happening, giving them a home, just as in Paris. And out of the Parisian tradition came St. Vladimir's Seminary. And so there's a large conversation going on between Catholic Anglicanism, of which Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, was a part, St. Vladimir's, Nashotah House. These are classical forms of Christianity in which there are those turning to that, whether of the Roman Catholic variety, the Catholic Anglican types, or Orthodoxy itself is a form of Christianity. Orthodoxy in time, like Anglicanism, like liberal Protestantism, like Roman Catholicism, is going to have to face into the challenges of the liberal modern project. And there is always this tendency within certain reactive forms of Christianity to see the liberal modern mood as the problem, and this re-entrenchment of a classical form of Christianity, and it becomes either or, ancient versus modern, or modern versus ancient. Usually if you're modern versus ancient, you caricature the ancients. If a person is ancient versus modern, they caricature the modern or postmodern. Obviously, as we move into the future, those simple, somewhat simplistic categories won't do. There are blind spots in the patristic tradition, and there is much gold. There is much insight in the liberal tradition. There is blind spots. There is often a weakness at the core of liberalism, which doesn't mean that some of the things it has fought against, rightly so, need to be honored. But often the dilemma of liberalism, it's strong on freedom from things, but very weak on once you're free from injustices and intellectual narrowness and shallowness, it has a great deal of difficulty articulating free for, because anything free for is again the problem which inhibits my liberty. And so, and orthodoxy is having to grapple with this very, very much also, and perhaps it more than the other forms of Christianity has not engaged the modern world as some of them have. And in that sense, it's a comfort for those who are trying to, they see the modern and postmodern as the problem, but they purchase their security at the price of not engaging the issues in a serious way. Now, they're very important modern Orthodox thinkers like Rowan Williams, for example, did his PhD on Losky. There's Florovsky, there's Schmemann. There's a whole range of important and significant Orthodox thinkers, Timothy Ware, Oxford. Nicholas Zernoff, when I did my first MA, the TA I worked with, he lived with Nicholas Zernoff, who was considered an Orthodox institution. C.S. Lewis was very good friends with Nicholas Zernoff of Orthodoxy, and out of that, as I mentioned earlier, came the Society of St. Alban and St. Sergius. And so there are very important Orthodox thinkers worth knowing and hearing in St. Vladimir's in the States, St. Bulgakov. I mean, there's loads of key people here. And so the Christian tradition, three big traditions, and there obviously is intermingling. There are paths crossing one another in these traditions. But within Roman Catholicism itself, you have it being pulled in different directions. In the present Pope, this is part of his tension and issues. Where does he go with something like that? The Anglican tradition pulled between its liberal element, its high church aspects, and its low church, evangelical, reformed, charismatic. The Protestant tradition pulled between, on the one hand, an assimilationist liberal tradition and a neo-Calvinist reaction tradition. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the biggest churches today are strongly committed to the neo-Calvinist agenda of Piper and Keller, MacArthur, Jim Packer standing back of something like that. And then the appeal of the Orthodox tradition and some pretty sophisticated theologians and philosophers within all that, and the very rich and vibrant liturgy of the Orthodox tradition. Each of these big forms of Christianity, Protestantism, Orthodoxy, and Roman Catholicism, has large challenges before them as they move into the 21st century. And it doesn't help to escape into some cloistered virtue. On the other hand, the dangers being knowing how to discerningly parse the good of the modern liberal, but also be able to see the dross in that and understand where does Christianity find its way, because there's no way people can ignore the issues as the ship of the church sails across the water of time. It's just discerning how that ship is to sail across the turbulent waters of time without being pulled down into the water and the ship going under itself. And so the Christian tradition, Roman Catholicism, torn internally, Protestantism pulled between forms of neo-Calvinism and liberalism. I could also mention there also is a form of Wesleyanism, Arminianism as well, but it's a minor voice within Protestantism. And then, of course, Orthodoxy and the turn to Orthodoxy by many who have gone through a conservative evangelical Protestant, Reformed, Lutheran, but they feel the fullness of the tradition is not there, hence the turn to the patristic or golden age of Orthodoxy in its relevance for our late modern, postmodern, early decades of the 20th century.